In the middle of Dallas, under the scorching Texas sun, an old mechanic with grease-stained hands dares to touch the engine of a millionaire's luxury car. The crowd laughs, the CEO smirks. How could this wrinkled man with worn-out overalls and shaky hands ever fix what the city's best technicians had already failed to repair? What no one knows is that inside this engine hides a secret capable of destroying fortunes, uncovering corruption, and proving that true worth has nothing to do with money, but everything to do with dignity. Dallas wasn't kind to men like Earl Jennings anymore. At 68, with stiff joints and hands scarred from decades of labor, he had become nearly invisible to the world he once kept running. He spent his days in a modest garage tucked behind a faded gas station on the outskirts of town. The paint on the walls was peeling, tools were mismatched and worn, and the old radio in the corner played country songs from an era long gone. Yet to Earl, this dusty workshop wasn't just a place to survive. It was home. Earl's life had always been about work. From the time he was 16, he'd been fixing engines, farm tractors, pickup trucks, heavy equipment. If it had pistons, gears, or a crankshaft, Earl could breathe life back into it. His reputation once carried weight. Farmers trusted him. Truckers sought him out on long hauls. And in his prime, Earl had been the man you called when no one else could solve the problem. But times had changed. Shiny new repair shops opened across the city, run by young men with tablets in their hands instead of grease under their nails. They spoke the language of software updates and digital diagnostics, while Earl still trusted his ear to hear an engine's soul. Customers who once respected his craft now saw him as a relic, someone too stubborn to adapt, too poor to keep up. Still, he refused to close his doors. Every morning, Earl brewed a strong pot of coffee, slipped on his old plaid shirt, and unlocked his garage at dawn. Some days he only got one customer, some days none at all. But quitting wasn't in his blood. His father had been a mechanic too, a quiet man who taught him not just how to fix machines, but how to stand tall, even when the world tried to push you down. Earl carried those lessons in silence, but his body bore the weight of them. His back ached from years of lifting transmissions, his fingers stiff from arthritis. He had a small house, nearly paid off, and no family left except an estranged son he hadn't spoken to in years. Life was simple, but it was honest. One evening, as he sat on a stool in his garage wiping down an old wrench, Earl remembered something his father once told him. Engines are like men. Treat them with respect, and they'll run longer than anyone expects. Disrespect them, and they'll let you down when it matters most. Earl lived by that rule. Not just with machines, but with people too. What made him stand apart wasn't just skill. It was dignity. He treated every customer the same, whether it was a farmer with a broken tractor or a businessman with a shiny SUV. And maybe that was why life had turned so hard on him. The world wasn't fair to men who refused to play by its crooked rules. That summer in Dallas had been brutal. The heat radiated off the asphalt, making the air shimmer like glass. Business was slower than ever. Earl worried about keeping the lights on, about whether this would finally be the year he had to shut his doors for good. And then, fate rolled into his life on 4 wheels, a sleek black luxury car, the kind Earl had only seen in magazines. It pulled up in front of his shabby garage, its polished chrome glittering in the sun, a machine worth more than Earl's house. He stood there, rag in hand, heart thudding in his chest, as the tinted window slid down. Inside sat a man Earl would never forget. His suit was tailored, his smile sharp, his tone dripping with arrogance. He was a CEO, a name Earl recognized from the news, and the problem was clear. His expensive car had failed him. Earl didn't know it yet, but this encounter would change his life forever. It would drag him through humiliation, pain, and ridicule, but also into a fight for dignity that no amount of money could buy. Because what rattled inside that luxury engine wasn't just a broken part. It was the first crack in the armor of power, a secret waiting to explode. The CEO's car purred to a stop outside Earl's old garage, but the engine quickly coughed and died, leaving behind an eerie silence. The driver's door opened, and out stepped Richard Halford, A man who looked like he had never gotten grease on his hands a day in his life. Tall, mid-40s, sharp jawline, perfect hair slicked back with precision. He was the picture of modern success. His tailored navy suit and polished shoes didn't belong anywhere near the cracked concrete and oil stains of Earl's shop. Richard glanced around with a look of disgust, as though the very air of this place was beneath him. "This dump?" he muttered loud enough for Earl to hear. "Figures. My assistant said this was the closest garage. God help me." Earl wiped his hands on his rag and stepped forward. "Afternoon. Car giving you trouble?" Richard turned, his eyes narrowing at the sight of the old man. He smirked, then let out a short laugh. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me. They sent me you. What are you, 80? A small group of people had gathered nearby. A gas station attendant leaned on the pump, curious. Two teenagers with skateboards paused to watch. To them, it was just another scene of old versus new, rich versus poor. Earl kept his tone steady. "I've been fixing engines longer than most folks have been alive. Let me take a look." Richard raised an eyebrow. "No offense, old-timer, but this car is worth more than your entire shop. I don't think I'll trust it to whatever this is." He gestured at Earl's grease-stained shirt, the cracked windows, the rusting sign above the garage door. The crowd chuckled. Earl felt the sting, but he didn't flinch. Engines don't care about money. They care about respect. That only made Richard laugh harder. Respect? This isn't some rusty tractor, Grandpa. This is a German masterpiece, a machine designed by people with degrees you can't even pronounce. And you expect me to believe you know better? The onlookers began to murmur. Some laughed openly. Earl's ears burned. He wanted to walk away, but something inside him, pride, dignity, maybe his father's voice, kept him rooted. Richard waved a dismissive hand. "Tell you what, I'll humor you. Go ahead. Take a peek under the hood. Let's see if you can even open it without breaking something." The hood latch clicked, and Earl slowly lifted the gleaming metal. Inside, the engine shone like jewelry, chrome and polished black parts meticulously designed. But Earl's experienced eye immediately noticed things others couldn't. A slight discoloration on a valve, a faint smell of something burning. He leaned closer, listening. Richard crossed his arms, smirking. "Careful, old man. Don't get drool on it." The teenagers snickered. Earl muttered, almost to himself. "This isn't right. This engine's been tampered with." Richard's head snapped up. "What did you just say?" Earl looked up, serious now. "I've seen thousands of engines. This one doesn't fail like this unless somebody's been inside it. Somebody wanted it to break." The crowd went quiet. Richard's face darkened, then twisted into a mocking grin. "Oh, now you're a detective, huh? What's next? You gonna tell me my car is haunted?" The laughter roared again, echoing in Earl's ears like hammers. His cheeks burned, but he stayed calm. "I'm just telling you what I see." Richard leaned closer, lowering his voice but making sure everyone could still hear. "Listen, old man. You touch my car again, and I'll have you sued into the dirt. You don't have the faintest clue what you're talking about. Maybe this is how you get by, feeding nonsense to farmers who don't know better. But me, I can smell a fraud a mile away." The words cut deep. Earl clenched his rag in his fist, feeling the rough fabric dig into his palm. He wanted to fight back, but every pair of eyes in that crowd was on him, waiting, judging. Finally, Richard snapped his fingers at his driver, who stood awkwardly by. "We're done here. Tow it to the dealership. At least there, real mechanics can look at it." The hood slammed shut, and the sound felt like a door closing on Earl's dignity. Richard brushed invisible dust off his jacket, smirked one last time, and turned to the crowd. "This is why people like me succeed, and people like him end up forgotten." The crowd chuckled again. Some shook their heads, pitying the old man. Earl stood frozen, his heart heavy, his reputation shredded in front of strangers. But deep inside, a spark of defiance lit, because Earl knew what he saw inside that engine, and he knew, whether Richard liked it or not, that truth has a way of roaring back to life when no one expects it. The morning after Richard Halford's cruel words, Earl tried to shake it off. He swept the shop floor, brewed his coffee, and told himself he'd seen worse. But the truth was, the humiliation cut deep. It wasn't just Richard's arrogance. It was the laughter of the crowd, the way strangers looked at him like he was a relic. Earl had spent his life earning respect through honest work, and in a single moment, it felt like all of it had been erased. He thought he'd never see that car again, but fate wasn't done with him. 2 days later, a flatbed truck rolled into Earl's lot. On the back was the same black luxury sedan, its hood strapped down, its glossy paint reflecting the sun. Earl froze mid-step, rag in hand. The driver hopped out and waved some paperwork. "You Earl Jennings?" "Yeah," Earl said cautiously. "Got an order here. Dealership says they can't figure this thing out. Corporate wants another set of eyes on it." "Yours." Earl blinked. "Mine? You sure?" The driver shrugged. "All I know is this car's been through 3 different shops. Nobody can keep it running. Some executive up the chain said your name." Earl's heart pounded. He hadn't touched cars like this in years. Machines stuffed with sensors, wires, and computers. But still, under all that, it was just an engine. And he'd never met an engine he couldn't figure out. As the truck pulled away, Earl walked around the car slowly, studying it like a surgeon before an operation. He could feel eyes on him again. The gas station attendant, a couple of truckers fueling up nearby. Word spread fast in small places, and this car drew attention like a magnet. He popped the hood and leaned in. Same faint smell, same suspicious wear. Earl frowned. Engines told stories, and this one whispered of sabotage. Someone wanted it broken. Someone had messed with its heart. Just then, a familiar voice cut through the air. "Well, well, well. Look who they dug up from the scrapyard." Richard Halford, dressed in another flawless suit, sunglasses perched on his nose. He strolled into the lot like he owned the ground he walked on. Behind him trailed a small entourage. 2 men in suits, a woman with a clipboard, and with them, a cameraman. Earl's gut tightened. Richard smirked. "I didn't believe it when they told me. But here you are, the ancient miracle worker, my car's last hope." He turned to his crew, chuckling. "This ought to be good." Earl straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow. "If you want me to walk away, say the word. But this car's sick, and I know it." Richard clapped his hands mockingly. "Oh, don't walk away, please. This is too entertaining. Let's make it interesting, shall we?" He gestured to the cameraman. "We're streaming this live. My followers love a good laugh. Let's see if Grandpa Jennings can outsmart German engineering." The cameraman zoomed in, and Earl's hands trembled slightly as he gripped his wrench. He hated cameras. He hated being put on display. But something in his chest, a mix of pride and fury, forced him to stay. Richard leaned in, voice dripping with sarcasm. "Here's the deal, old man. You fix this car today, in front of everyone, and maybe, I'll admit you're not completely useless. But if you fail, and I guarantee you will, the whole world gets to watch you crumble. Fair enough?" The crowd was already forming again, drawn by the spectacle. Phones came out. People whispered. Earl's humiliation had gone from a private sting to a public circus. He tightened his jaw. Engines don't care about age. They care about respect, and I respect this one enough to try. Richard burst into laughter, clapping his hands. "Oh, this is rich. Go ahead, Jennings. Impress us. Show us what dignity looks like when it falls flat on its face." Earl bent over the engine, blocking out the laughter, the cameras, the arrogance. He ran his fingers along the pipes, tapped the housing, listened to the faintest clicks. His mind worked like it had for decades, patient, methodical, unyielding. But the more he dug, the clearer it became. This wasn't a normal breakdown. The software diagnostics had been scrambled. A valve had been deliberately loosened, wires rerouted. This wasn't just mechanical, it was intentional. Richard's voice boomed behind him. "What's wrong, Grandpa? Cat got your tongue? Need a nap before you get started?" Earl didn't answer. He couldn't. Not yet. Because the more he uncovered, the more dangerous this truth became. He realized then, fixing this car wasn't just about saving face, it was about exposing something far bigger. something Richard didn't want anyone to see. The challenge wasn't impossible because of the machine. It was impossible because the truth hidden inside this engine had the power to ruin powerful men. And standing over it, Earl knew one thing. If he went through with this, his life would never be the same. The heat in Dallas pressed down like a hammer as Earl bent over the open hood. Sweat ran down his temples, stinging his eyes. But he kept working. The small crowd had doubled, drawn in by the sight of an old mechanic facing off against a millionaire CEO and his entourage. Phones were raised high, every angle captured, every mistake waiting to go viral. Richard Halford paced like a ringmaster in a circus, feeding the crowd with smirks and sharp words. Ladies and gentlemen, history in the making, a relic of the past, trying to breathe life into a machine he can't possibly understand. Watch closely. You'll never see failure look this pitiful again. The laughter was relentless. Some chuckled nervously, others cackled openly. The teenagers from earlier had returned, shouting, "Don't break it, Grandpa!" Earl's ears burned red, but he forced himself to ignore it. He adjusted a wrench, tightening a valve he suspected had been tampered with. His hands shook, not from weakness, but from the weight of 1,000 eyes waiting for him to fall. He needed focus. Engines didn't respond to panic, only patience. Then, with a deep breath, Earl turned the key. The engine sputtered, coughed, rattled, and then died in a puff of smoke. The silence lasted only a moment before the eruption came. The crowd roared with laughter. Someone clapped mockingly. A voice shouted, "Guess it's time for the retirement home!" Phones zoomed in on Earl's face, capturing every crease of his humiliation. Richard stepped forward, arms outstretched like he'd just won a championship. There it is. Ladies and gentlemen, the so-called legend of Dallas mechanics has spoken. And what has he said? Nothing. Because he's finished. Earl's chest tightened. His dignity, once his armor, now felt stripped away. He could almost hear his father's voice, whispering, "Stand tall, son." But in that moment, he wanted nothing more than to disappear. Richard circled the car like a predator circling prey. "Do you understand now, old man? Your time is over. Men like you had your day. But the future doesn't need greasy hands and guesswork. The future belongs to precision, to intelligence, to men like me." He leaned close, his whisper sharp enough for Earl alone. "And if you ever mention sabotage again, I'll bury you. No one will believe you anyway, look at them." Richard gestured at the crowd, who were still laughing, still recording, still shaking their heads. To them, Earl was a fool who didn't know when to quit. Earl's hand slipped off the hood, and for the first time in decades he felt powerless. His heart hammered in his chest, his throat dry. He wanted to defend himself, to explain what he'd seen in that engine, but the words caught in his throat. If he spoke, it would sound like excuses. Richard turned back to the crowd, raising his voice again. "This is why we don't cling to the past. This is why success is built by vision, not rust. And this," he tapped the hood of his car, "is proof that some men should have walked away long ago." The cameras caught it all. The humiliation wasn't just in this parking lot. It was spreading online, second by second, to thousands who would never know Earl's story, never know the truth. Earl's knees wobbled. He leaned against the fender, staring at the ground. He could feel the laughter echoing inside his skull. Every insult, every smirk, every cruel word piled onto his back like bricks. It was his lowest point. Richard, satisfied with his victory, snapped his fingers at his driver. "Tow it back to the dealership. We'll find someone competent this time." The hood slammed shut with a metallic thud. The crowd began to disperse, still chuckling, still sharing clips on their phones. Earl stood alone, drowning in the silence that followed. The old mechanic pressed his hands against the car, his fingers trembling. He whispered to himself, "Engines don't lie. Not to me." He closed his eyes, drawing in a long breath, feeling the sting of shame settle deep in his chest. This wasn't just about a car anymore. It was about his life, his worth, his very identity. And as painful as this fall was, some small ember inside him refused to die, because Earl knew what he had seen in that engine, and one day soon he would make it roar back to life, not for Richard, not for the crowd, but for himself, and for every man who had ever been laughed at, doubted, or cast aside. The world thought he was finished, but they hadn't seen the fight still left in him. That night, Earl sat alone in his garage, the silence pressing in like a weight. The laughter from earlier echoed in his mind, replaying over and over, the jeers, the smirks, Richard's cruel words. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the puff of smoke from that luxury engine and the look of triumph on Richard's face. He wanted to quit. For the first time in 50 years, Earl thought about locking up his shop for good. Maybe Richard was right. Maybe the world had passed him by. But then he looked down at his hands, scarred, calloused, stained with grease that no soap could ever wash away. These hands had built his life, fed him, carried him through decades of hard work, and they weren't ready to quit yet. He walked over to the car, still sitting silently in his garage after the driver dropped it off. Earl had signed the paperwork. Corporate wanted him to give it one more try before the dealership shipped it out of state. He placed his hand gently on the hood. "Engines don't lie," he whispered, "and neither will I." He rolled up his sleeves, lit a single hanging bulb overhead, and began again. The hours slipped by. Earl worked the way he always had, not with fancy diagnostic computers, but with patience, memory, and instinct. He listened to the clicks and groans of the machine. He traced the wires with his fingertips, feeling where the insulation had been cut and spliced. He tightened bolts with the precision of a surgeon. At one point, frustration welled up, and he slammed his fist on the workbench. Why would anyone do this to a car like this? He muttered. The answer chilled him, because the engine was hiding something it wasn't supposed to. The sabotage wasn't random. It was careful, deliberate. Earl knew it now. This car wasn't just a machine. It was evidence. He grabbed his notebook, the same battered one he'd kept since he was a young man. Inside were sketches, notes, even grease-stained fingerprints from years gone by. Earl began documenting everything he saw. The rewired connections, the valves tampered with, the falsified codes that popped up when he tested the electrical. Piece by piece, the story unfolded. His body ached, but his mind was alive. Every twist of a wrench was like turning back the clock. He remembered fixing tractors under the blazing sun with his father. He remembered long nights helping truckers get back on the road. He remembered why he loved this work. It wasn't just machines. It was giving people their lives back. The sun began to rise, pouring golden light through the dusty windows of his garage. Earl's shirt was soaked with sweat, his knuckles scraped, his body sore. But the engine was beginning to respond. He tightened one last bolt, then sat back, wiping his brow. "You're not dead yet," he said softly, almost as if he were speaking to himself as much as to the car. For the first time since his humiliation, Earl allowed himself a small smile. He wasn't done, not by a long shot. But then came the doubt. What if he was wrong? What if Richard came back and humiliated him again, this time in front of even more people? Earl shook his head, forcing the thought away. Fear wouldn't fix this engine, only persistence would. He decided to rest for a few hours. But even as he lay on his old cot in the corner of the garage, his mind kept working. He could hear the faint hum of the engine in his dreams, as if it were whispering its secrets to him. When he awoke, he felt renewed, not young, but determined. He grabbed his tools again, ready to face whatever came next. Because if he could make this machine roar back to life, it would mean more than repairing a car. It would mean repairing his dignity. And deep down, Earl knew this wasn't just about him. This was about every man who'd ever been told he was too old, too slow, too forgotten. Every man who had been laughed at by someone richer, younger, or more powerful. As he set his wrench against the final adjustment, Earl whispered, "This isn't just your fight, Richard. This is mine." The garage filled with the sound of clinking metal, the smell of oil and sweat, the heartbeat of a man refusing to surrender. And soon, Dallas would hear the roar of a comeback no one expected. That night, Earl sat alone in his garage, the silence pressing in like a weight. The laughter from earlier echoed in his mind, replaying over and over. The jeers, the smirks, Richard's cruel words. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the puff of smoke from that luxury engine and the look of triumph on Richard's face. He wanted to quit. For the first time in 50 years, Earl thought about locking up his shop for good. Maybe Richard was right. Maybe the world had passed him by. But then he looked down at his hands, scarred, calloused, stained with grease that no soap could ever wash away. These hands had built his life, fed him, carried him through decades of hard work, and they weren't ready to quit yet. He walked over to the car, still sitting silently in his garage after the driver dropped it off. Earl had signed the paperwork. Corporate wanted him to give it one more try before the dealership shipped it out of state. He placed his hand gently on the hood. "Engines don't lie," he whispered. "And neither will I." He rolled up his sleeves, lit a single hanging bulb overhead, and began again. The hours slipped by. Earl worked the way he always had, not with fancy diagnostic computers, but with patience, memory, and instinct. He listened to the clicks and groans of the machine. He traced the wires with his fingertips, feeling where the insulation had been cut and spliced. He tightened bolts with the precision of a surgeon. At one point, frustration welled up, and he slammed his fist on the workbench. "Why would anyone do this to a car like this?" he muttered. The answer chilled him. Because the engine was hiding something it wasn't supposed to. The sabotage wasn't random. It was careful, deliberate. Earl knew it now. This car wasn't just a machine. It was evidence. He grabbed his notebook, the same battered one he'd kept since he was a young man. Inside were sketches, notes, even grease-stained fingerprints from years gone by. Earl began documenting everything he saw. The rewired connections, the valves tampered with, the falsified codes that popped up when he tested the electrical. Piece by piece, the story unfolded. His body ached, but his mind was alive. Every twist of a wrench was like turning back the clock. He remembered fixing tractors under the blazing sun with his father. He remembered long nights helping truckers get back on the road. He remembered why he loved this work. It wasn't just machines. It was giving people their lives back. The sun began to rise, pouring golden light through the dusty windows of his garage. Earl's shirt was soaked with sweat, his knuckles scraped, his body sore. But the engine was beginning to respond. He tightened one last bolt, then sat back, wiping his brow. "You're not dead yet," he said softly, almost as if he were speaking to himself, as much as to the car. For the first time since his humiliation, Earl allowed himself a small smile. He wasn't done, not by a long shot. But then came the doubt. What if he was wrong? What if Richard came back and humiliated him again, this time in front of even more people? Earl shook his head, forcing the thought away. Fear wouldn't fix this engine. Only persistence would. He decided to rest for a few hours. But even as he lay on his old cot in the corner of the garage, his mind kept working. He could hear the faint hum of the engine in his dreams, as if it were whispering its secrets to him. When he awoke, he felt renewed, not young, but determined. He grabbed his tools again, ready to face whatever came next. Because if he could make this machine roar back to life, it would mean more than repairing a car. It would mean repairing his dignity. And deep down, Earl knew this wasn't just about him. This was about every man who'd ever been told he was too old, too slow, too forgotten. Every man who had been laughed at by someone richer, younger, or more powerful. As he set his wrench against the final adjustment, Earl whispered, "This isn't just your fight, Richard. This is mine." The garage filled with the sound of clinking metal, the smell of oil and sweat, the heartbeat of a man refusing to surrender. And soon, Dallas would hear the roar of a comeback no one expected. The following evening, the garage was silent except for the slow ticking of Earl's old clock on the wall. He stood in front of the black luxury sedan, sleeves rolled up, hands blackened with grease. His back ached from bending over the engine for hours, but he didn't care. This was the moment. Either the machine roared to life, or his dignity remained buried under Richard Halford's laughter. Earl tightened one last screw, wiped his hands on his rag, and stared at the car. The smell of oil and hot metal filled the air. His heart pounded as he slid into the driver's seat. The leather was too soft, too polished for a man like him. But the engine, it was his battlefield, his language, his truth. He inserted the key and turned it. The engine coughed, sputtered, and for a terrifying second, Earl thought it was going to die again. His chest tightened, but then, like a deep breath after being underwater too long, the machine roared alive. A smooth, powerful growl filled the garage, shaking the windows and rattling the tools on the walls. Earl closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. Tears burned at the corners of his eyes. It wasn't just the car that had come back to life. It was him. But then something caught his ear, a subtle rhythm in the engine's hum. Earl frowned and leaned closer. To most people, it would sound perfect, but not to him. There was a message in the way it pulsed, something hidden inside its performance software. He popped the hood and listened again. The tampering wasn't just to break the car, it was to cover something up. Earl hooked up his old laptop, an antique compared to the flashy systems at dealerships. He began pulling data from the engine's black box, line by line. What he found made his blood run cold. Buried inside the code were hidden sequences, evidence of fuel manipulations, emission overrides, things that shouldn't be there. This wasn't just about one car. It was about a fleet, about fraud on a scale that could topple companies. Earl sat back, breathing heavily. Richard Halford hadn't just wanted to humiliate him. He wanted to bury the truth this car carried under the hood. The realization hardened Earl's resolve. He wasn't just fighting for his pride anymore. He was fighting for justice. The next morning, the car purred outside his garage, drawing the attention of neighbors and curious passers-by. Word spread fast. The old man had done it. The impossible car, the one no dealership could fix, was alive again. And right on cue, Richard arrived. Same tailored suit, same smug grin. This time, he brought even more people, business partners, reporters, another cameraman. The humiliation was supposed to continue. But Earl wasn't the same man anymore. He leaned casually against the car, arms folded as Richard strutted up. "Well, well, look at that," Richard said, feigning surprise. "You actually got it running. I'll admit, I didn't think you had it in you." He smirked at the cameras. "But let's be honest, folks. A running engine doesn't mean it's fixed. Probably just a lucky patch job. Right, Grandpa?" Earl didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he opened the driver's door and gestured. "Go on, take her for a spin." Richard raised an eyebrow. He looked at the cameras, then at the car, then shrugged with exaggerated confidence. Sliding into the seat, he turned the key. The engine roared to life, smooth as silk. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Richard revved it once, twice, then leaned out the window with a forced grin. "Not bad. Looks like you finally got something right." But Earl's voice cut through the air, steady and firm. "It's not just fixed, Mr. Halford. It's talking." And I heard what it had to say. The crowd stirred, confused. Richard's smile faltered. Earl held up his grease-stained notebook. This engine wasn't broken by accident. It was sabotaged to hide corruption. And now the truth is out in the open. Gasps spread. Cameras zoomed in. Richard's eyes flashed with panic before he quickly masked it with a laugh. "Oh, please. Are you really going to stand there and spout conspiracy theories? This old man doesn't know what he's talking about. Look at him." But the engine purred behind Richard, and Earl's steady gaze never wavered. For the first time, Richard's arrogance looked less like confidence and more like fear. The crowd sensed it, and Earl knew the balance of power had just shifted. Richard Halford stepped out of the car, but this time his trademark grin didn't land. The smooth growl of the engine behind him, flawless and strong, was a sound he could not deny. It was the sound of his defeat. The crowd pressed closer, phones high, whispers spreading like wildfire. Everyone could feel it. The tide had turned. Richard raised his hands, forcing a smile that trembled at the edges. Well, I suppose even an old dog can get lucky once in a while. His voice cracked, thinner than before. Earl said nothing. He simply stood, notebook in hand, calm and resolute, his silence louder than any insult. Richard's throat tightened. He scanned the crowd, searching desperately for the laughter that had always been on his side. But the chuckles were gone. Faces that once sneered at Earl now glared at him. His entourage shifted uncomfortably, their confidence evaporating. "You think this means anything?" Richard snapped suddenly, his voice rising, anger seeping through. "He fixed a car, that's all. It doesn't make him special." But even as he shouted, his eyes glistened. Sweat beaded on his forehead, though the evening air had cooled. He tugged at his tie as if it were strangling him. Earl finally spoke, his tone steady, each word a nail in the coffin of Richard's pride. "I didn't just fix it. I uncovered the truth you tried to bury. This engine isn't a machine. It's evidence. And you knew it." Gasps rippled through the crowd. All cameras turned to Richard. His lips quivered, his bravado faltering. That's ridiculous. You think anyone's going to believe a washed-up mechanic over me? I built this city. But his words cracked. His chest heaved as though the weight of his lies was finally pressing down too heavy to carry. Earl took a step closer, his voice low but cutting through the silence. "What you built, Mr. Halford, was arrogance, and it just collapsed." The crowd erupted. Cheers, applause, even shouts of anger at Richard. His face flushed crimson. He tried to smirk, but the corners of his mouth trembled. His eyes darted wildly, desperate for an escape. One of his own men muttered, not quietly enough, "He's finished." Richard spun on him, fury and fear twisting his face. "Shut up! You don't know what you're saying." His voice broke again, ragged now, almost pleading. The chant began then, strong and united. "Earl! Earl! Earl!" Richard's chest rose and fell rapidly, his composure shattered. He looked at Earl, not with arrogance now, but with something closer to desperation, even fear. His pride, his shield, had splintered in front of the very people he once ruled with his image. Earl didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He simply nodded once, firm and calm, as if sealing the moment. Later that night, long after the crowd had dispersed, Richard sat in the back of his sleek black car, staring blankly out the window. His hands shook as he tugged at his tie again, whispering to himself, "This can't be happening. Not to me." But it was. And for the first time in his life, Richard Halford felt what it was like to be small. Meanwhile, back in his garage, Earl sat quietly with his notebook open, the evidence spread before him. He wasn't smiling. Victory didn't taste like triumph, but like responsibility. Because now he knew the truth, and he knew the fight wasn't finished. But one thing was certain, Richard Halford's pride had been broken, and from here on out, the balance of power would never be the same. The next morning, Dallas woke up to a different kind of news. Clips from the confrontation outside Earl's garage had gone viral overnight. Millions watched the old mechanic restore a car that no dealership could fix. Millions more replayed the moment Richard Halford's arrogance cracked in front of the crowd. For the first time, the laughter wasn't at Earl. It was at Richard. Talk shows mocked his trembling voice. Headlines questioned his integrity, and investors, smelling blood, began to whisper about investigations. The empire Richard had built on pride was starting to crumble. Meanwhile, Earl sat quietly in his garage, sipping black coffee from his chipped mug. He wasn't chasing fame. He wasn't basking in glory. He was just the same man he had always been, humble, steady, working with his hands. But something had changed. For the first time in years, people looked at him with respect again. And then, as if fate demanded closure, Richard returned. He came without cameras, without an entourage. No suit this time, just a wrinkled shirt, eyes heavy, face pale. He stepped into the garage slowly, like a man who no longer owned the ground beneath him. Earl didn't look up at first. He kept polishing a wrench, letting the silence stretch. Finally, Richard cleared his throat. "I came to talk," he muttered. His voice lacked the sharpness it once carried. It was fragile now, almost human. Earl glanced at him. "Talk, then." Richard swallowed hard. "I don't expect forgiveness. I know what I did to you. I humiliated you. I mocked you. And you—" He hesitated, his lip trembling. "You proved me wrong." The words hung in the air like a confession. Earl said nothing, letting Richard struggle through the weight of his own pride collapsing. Richard's eyes watered, and he quickly looked away. "I built my whole life on being untouchable, on being the man no one could laugh at. And now," he shook his head, voice breaking, "now the whole world sees me for what I am." Earl set down the wrench and wiped his hands on his rag. His voice was calm, steady. "Machines don't care about your pride, Richard. They don't care about your money. They only care about truth. And when you lie, when you cheat, when you disrespect what's real, they let you down. Just like people do." Richard lowered his head. For the first time, he looked small. Not a CEO, not a titan of industry, but just a man who had finally been stripped of everything fake. "You were right," Richard whispered. "Respect matters more than money." Earl studied him, then gave a slow nod. "Took you long enough to learn it." The silence lingered. It wasn't reconciliation, not yet, but it was a crack in the wall Richard had built around himself. When Richard finally left, Earl sat back on his stool, staring at the empty doorway. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "Treat engines with respect, and they'll last longer than anyone expects." Maybe the same was true of men. Earl smiled faintly, not for victory, but for peace. He had been humiliated, broken, laughed at, and he had risen, not with arrogance, but with dignity. And that was the real lesson. So if you've ever been laughed at for being old, poor, or underestimated, remember Earl Jennings. Remember that true worth isn't measured in wealth or titles, but in persistence, respect, and dignity. Have you ever been treated like Earl? Mocked, doubted, underestimated? Share your story in the comments. And if you believe experience always beats arrogance, give this video a like. Because stories like Earl's deserve to be heard, remembered, and shared. So hit subscribe and join me for the next one, because the fight for dignity is never over.